So let's talk about genetic predisposition. So over 20 genes have been discovered that have some relationship to Alzheimer's disease. And the one that's the most important we're going to talk about for a second here is ApoE. It's a gene on chromosome 19, and it's involved in the production of apolipoprotein E. It carries fat and cholesterol throughout the body, repairs brain cells, and builds synapses. Now, each gene has two alleles. You get one from your mom and you get one from your dad. And in the case of the alleles that go with this gene, E2 reduces the risk of Alzheimer's disease, but it increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. E3, no increased risk, but the E4 allele is a problem. If the allele is from both parents, it's really a problem. 3 times greater risk. If it's from one parent, 10 to 15 times greater risk if it is from both parents. However, the important thing to point out about genetics is you can have a terrible genetic profile where, and I do, by the way, lots of diseases run in my family that I don't want to get. I don't have them, so I have used diet and lifestyle to overcome my genetic history, all right, predisposition. Now, on the other hand, you could have a great genetic profile. Everybody in your family lives to be 110 years old, and nobody develops cancer or heart disease or any of those kinds of things. And you can overwrite that with misbehavior. So the question is, which are you going to do? So I'll give you an example of the different outcomes here. The Honolulu Asian Aging Study looked at Japanese people living in the United States and compared to Japanese people living in Japan. And of course, there wasn't much genetic difference between the groups, but there was an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease in the American population because of diet, exercise, and lifestyle habits. In China, we see the world's, unfortunately, largest diabetic population, and what we have seen is that the incidence of Alzheimer's disease, which was unheard of in China just a few years ago, has been increasing exactly at the same rate as the incidence of diabetes. So the Chinese people are not predisposed to develop Alzheimer's disease. They're inducing this increasing incidence by adopting Western habits. So you're not stuck with your genes. Okay, so having said this, we look at the 4 main influences, and let's take a look at the specific things that lead to and can lead away from developing Alzheimer's disease. So the first thing is sleep. People who do not get enough sleep, and I'm not talking about sleep deprived for a night, I'm talking about people who just chronically don't sleep or don't sleep well, really impair brain function. Because while you're sleeping, your brain is performing, I call it metabolic housekeeping, taking out the trash, strengthening the connections, taking the stuff that you learned today and storing it properly and integrating it with everything that you already know. In fact, we have MRI images now that show information literally being taken from the front of the brain where it comes in and it's like the temporary holding facility, and going to the back of the brain where it's kept for permanent storage. Well, that doesn't happen when you're awake. So if you don't sleep well, you increase your risk of developing some type of cognitive dysfunction. Executive function is affected by lack of sleep. We even have studies that show that sleep deprivation for a night can make you less sharp. I don't think that shocks anybody. If you had a bad night or stayed up all night because your plane was late or whatever, you're probably not doing your best work at 8 o'clock in the morning at your desk. Sleep-deprived people actually accumulate more amyloid in their brains. And healthy neurons and connections can be destroyed by lack of sleep. So I think we can say, good idea to get sleep every night, enough of it. Another risk factor is obesity. The cardiovascular health study showed that obesity in midlife increased the risk of dementia by 40%. A 2016 study showed that obese patients had less white matter in their brains, which results in slower signaling and processing. And so it isn't the obesity itself that's contributing, although obesity increases generalized inflammation, and that is a factor. It's the habits that lead to obesity, being more sedentary, eating more fat, overeating too many calories, et cetera, that contribute to this. So staying lean is a good idea. In fact, if you look at pictures of centenarians online, you don't see any that are obese. The obese people die off earlier. The centenarians are pretty lean people. I don't think that most people would say that there's any reason to encourage smoking. But here's one more reason to discourage it, and that is that it impairs blood flow and it leads to an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. Data from over 7,200 people show that as people age, smokers will have a much more rapid decline in brain function than people who don't smoke. Smoking promotes the accumulation of these abnormal proteins in the brain much faster that interfere with brain function. Quitting helps, by the way. If you are a smoker and you quit smoking, within 10 years, your risk factor will be the same as if you had never smoked. So you're not stuck with that either. All of this is fixable. Higher insulin levels are a factor. So this isn't surprising based on the data that I showed you about diabetics having a higher risk. People with insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, high cholesterol, obesity, all of these things that come under the category of metabolic syndrome are at higher risk of vascular dementia, stroke, and Alzheimer's disease. The common denominator, what makes all these, what puts them all in this category, is mitochondrial dysfunction. It's exacerbated by age, but the changes begin decades before diagnosis. So if you have high blood glucose levels, you have a 35% risk of dementia. If you have glucose levels in the diabetic range, it goes up to 74% increased risk, which is really significant. Now, remember what I said about what's good for the cardiovascular system is good for the brain. Coronary artery disease is a major risk factor. Hypertension narrows and blocks arteries. Cholesterol triggers the formation of toxic clusters of amyloid beta protein in the brain. Hypertension in midlife is particularly associated with an increased risk of dementia. AFib is a risk factor. Addressing it either with drugs or some other form of treatment reduces the risk. But when you think about it, if the brain is using so much oxygen and glucose, anything that impairs the delivery of those things to the brain would be a factor, and that's where your cardiovascular system becomes important. Psychological state is an issue. Anxiety and depression increase the production of stress hormones like cortisol, which prunes the synapses. And research shows that consistently high levels of cortisol cause increased risk of cognitive decline. The severity, and this is important, anytime you see a dose-dependent relationship, this usually strengthens the association. So the severity of the mood disorder, mild depression isn't as harmful as severe depression. Mild anxiety, not as much of a risk factor as severe anxiety. I don't recommend addressing these things with drugs, but I do recommend addressing them because, first of all, it leads to a better quality of life, and it will prevent a lot of other bad things from happening, like cognitive decline. Being sedentary is a risk factor. People who spend the most time watching television have the highest risk of Alzheimer's disease, and that's probably somewhat due to the mind-numbing content that is available today. But it's also because the more you sit, the less active you are, the more gray matter you tend to lose. Now, here's the big thing, nutrition and cognitive function. So the brain's using 25% of the energy that you're taking in, which makes it particularly vulnerable to bad choices. So what you eat can either promote healthy brain function or it can destroy healthy brain function. So good food is the best available resource to preserve brain health. And it's also the thing that you can have somewhat the most control over, is what you put in your mouth every day.